How can the United States end its epidemic of racist police violence? The question is raised with new urgency in the wake of each new death, from George Floyd to Breonna Taylor, and most recently the killing of Tyre Nichols, brutally beaten by 5 officers last month during a traffic stop in Memphis, Tennessee. Today's prospective guest is a man who spent a lot of time thinking about the question. Jack Glaser is a social psychologist who specializes in racial bias and policing at the University of California, Berkeley. He joins us by video. Professor Glaser, it's an honor to have you. Could you maybe start by just breaking down the many ways in which racial bias contributes to violent police encounters?
Yeah, thanks for having me. There really are many ways, and I want to point out first that most police encounters are more mundane than the ones that we tend to hear about, and that there tends to be activism around. But nevertheless, they visit harms and burdens on minority communities, even regular mundane traffic stops and searches and the like. But what we see in a situation like the Tyre Nichols killing is officers getting out of control and beating him senseless to the point where he died of resulting injuries. And there is clear evidence that there is a racial component to these. In this case, it's complicated because the officers and the victim were Black. But there's also plenty of scientific evidence that says that Black police officers and others hold in their heads the same kinds of negative stereotypes of Black civilians that white officers do.
And some have argued that police forces need to be more diverse and have racial sensitivity trainings, but has the Tyre Nichols case made it clear, as you were saying, that it doesn't actually matter who's policing? Does the problem lie with the institution itself?
I think there's a good argument to be made that the institution of policing is one that is toxic in the sense of putting too much emphasis on the danger that officers face and the concern over ending their shift alive and the like. But I think that there are things that can be done. It's not clear that diversifying forces will necessarily help, and clearly this case is a counterpoint to that. But it wouldn't just be a matter of numerically diversifying departments racially, but actually integrating those departments and creating cultural awareness around different racial and ethnic groups. As far as trainings are concerned, there are no existing trainings that we know that will actually affect this kind of behavior in the field. And so that's an area that still needs a lot of work.
And can you talk about perhaps if there are any examples of policies that do work to reduce police violence, maybe just to be a little more specific?
Yeah, there's some evidence that, for example, de-escalation training there are some de-escalation trainings that are effective. There are other things like, for example, in this case, these officers were engaged in a pursuit and their adrenaline was flowing. And had they had some better policies in place, like the one that they have in the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, where the officers who are in pursuit are not the ones to lay hands on the suspect once they get cornered, there are things that can be done. And for that matter, there are tactical things that officers can do. So, for example, when approaching a fraught situation that might involve the need to use deadly force, slowing things down, taking cover, keeping distance, talking to people, not having every officer on the scene with their gun drawn. There are tactical things that can really reduce these from happening. And there are police departments around the U.S. who have seen declines in their fatal use of force as a result of employing these kinds of tactics.
And there is federal legislation on the table in the U.S. that would be aimed at tackling police violence, the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. It's been stalled in Congress for over a year and a half. What do you see as the biggest obstacle to police reform and to passing that act? Where's the resistance coming from?
I think the resistance there is just a chronic case of fear of looking weak on crime. And that is something that plagues American politicians on both sides of the aisle. But there is a tendency on the right side of the aisle to be especially loath to constrain policing in any way. And so that's been something that's been very difficult to pass. They haven't been able to pass a ban on racial profiling at the federal level. And as you know, they haven't been able to pass any meaningful anti-violence gun legislation at the federal level as well. And so there are political barriers to that and cultural barriers to that, but something needs to get done. And one thing to bear in mind is that the U.S. in the U.S., policing is highly decentralized. We have roughly 18,000 police departments and sheriff's departments around the U.S., and they do not respond to any centralized command and control from the federal government. The federal government has very relatively weak levers for affecting what happens in policing. But if Congress were to pass and the president were to sign law that changed the rules around how policing operates, that could have a national effect.
And there are people who worry that less policing or reducing the powers of police could lead to more crime. What do you think of those concerns?
Well, I think, if we were to remove police altogether, there's a good argument to be made that some kinds of crimes would fail to be deterred and some kinds of criminals would fail to be incapacitated. But I think that there's a happy medium where police proactivity and aggressiveness is reined in, and we still have the same kind of crime control or rates of crime that we're seeing. So, for example, in New York City, when Stop and Frisk, which is an aggressive program where the New York Police Department, which is the largest department in the country, was stopping hundreds of thousands of mostly young Black men on the street every year. When that got ruled unconstitutional, and the city had to cease and desist, there were a lot of people saying, well, this is going to cause crime to spike in New York. And years into that, that's not been the case. And some of those prominent skeptics have, to their credit, issued mea culpa saying that they were wrong about that. So it's not necessarily the case that more policing relates to less crime. And a lot of police chiefs will tell you that they don't have a lot of control over crime. They can enforce the laws, but what affects crime is underlying socioeconomic conditions, cultural conditions, well-being of people and the like, and police can mostly only react.
And you mentioned that there's more research that does need to be done to find effective policies. Could you maybe briefly talk about some of the questions that you're currently exploring in your research?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is generally efforts to constrain the discretion that police officers have. And it's a very difficult job. There's no question that, you have to give a lot of credit to police officers, and it's a stressful job. And frankly, the greatest occupational hazard is mental health, not physical health, and their relationships that suffer as a result of they're constantly being on the lookout for negative behavior. But one of the things that police have is a tremendous amount of discretion in how they can carry out their business, who they can stop, who they can search, who they can choose to arrest, conditional upon finding evidence of a crime. And that discretion creates a real opening for mental shortcuts like racial stereotypes. And one of the prominent racial stereotypes in America is the one connecting Black people with crime. And it causes police officers and others to misinterpret ambiguous behaviors that people are exhibiting and then regard them as suspicious, or in the case of the use of lethal force, to perceive their ambiguous behaviors as being more threatening than they actually are. And so if we can rein in that discretion, it's not something anybody wants to be told that they're going to have less discretion in how they do their job. But if we can, for example, eliminate pretextual stops, which is something that San Francisco, where I live, has just done, and something that Los Angeles has gone some distance toward reining in, but preventing officers from pulling people over for broken taillights just so that they can search them and look for drugs.
All right, Professor Glaser, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. That was Jack Glaser, a social psychologist specializing in racial bias in policing at the University of California, Berkeley.